Welcome to the Reality Revolution. I am your host, Brian Scott. Today, I wanted to spend some time discussing out-of-body experiences. Often I get messages. Somebody wakes up in the night and they've experienced something outside of their body, or they have a traumatic event and they leave their body. I have questions about what this means. Can we travel outside of our body consciously on a regular basis? There is so much interesting research and literature on it, so I wanted to discuss what I found research-wise on discussions of out-of-body experiences. One great place to look is a book by D. Scott Rogo, Exploring Psychic Phenomenon Beyond Mind and Matter. Captain Burton, a British soldier, died one evening of heart failure. His doctors thought him lost, but he survived and lived for many years after his death. He had a strange story to tell. I found myself standing at the foot of my bed, looking at myself and the doctor and feeling very well and bright, though puzzled. Then suddenly I found myself dragged violently over the bed rail, where I floated above myself, following which came a tremendous crash. Then I heard the doctor's voice. "He is coming round." He had considered me dead for some time. Captain Burton's experience is reported by many who have cheated death. Yet this enigmatic experience is not restricted to only those who have trespassed on death, but to hundreds of others in all cultures. Parapsychologists call Captain Burton's experience the out-of-body experience, OBE, which has replaced the older term astral projection. At one time, those who had this experience were reticent about speaking of it, fearing either ridicule or charges of insanity. But in spite of this, parapsychologists have been able to assemble hundreds of such reports from perfectly normal individuals, and attempts have been made at studying the phenomenon in the laboratory as well. ESP can manifest in a variety of ways, and the OBE is certainly what one would call a psi-conductive state. ESP is so often a byproduct of the out-of-body experience that it seems some element of the mind actually leaves the body in order to gather up information, which after the experience is returned to the brain. F.W. Pear had such experience when he had spontaneous out-of-body experience while lying in an army barracks. Finding my thinking self-suspended in midair over my body should have been rather a shock, but all the time I felt it be quite natural and not at all unpleasant. Indeed, I found the buoyant feeling that accompanied my apparent weightlessness state most interesting. If I thought of a given position to the left, I instantly moved left. If to the right, I moved right, and so on without any effort whatsoever. I went into the corridor where I observed someone had left the light on. I returned to my bunk, and there found my body lying in peaceful repose. At first I just thought this rather odd, but soon panic seized me as I realized the implications of the situation and wondered how to get back inside. A swift black falling sensation followed. I remembered no more until the morning. A sergeant came round demanding who had left a light on in the corridor last night. This case, reported in Robert Crookall's More Astral Projections, is typical of many out-of-body experiences. Over the years, hundreds of ordinary, everyday businessmen, wives, and artisans have had this experience, and all report a similar set of observations. Sir Auckland Geddes, a well-known, respected British medical man, reported an odd experience of this type to the Royal Medical Society of Edinburgh. While attributing the experience to another doctor, it is generally believed that Geddes was speaking from first-hand experience. I was very ill, but suddenly realized that my consciousness was separating from another consciousness which was also me. The ego consciousness, which was now me, seemed to be altogether outside my body, which I could see. Geddes found himself in an apparitional body. He saw his doctor try to revive him with a camphor injection. His consciousness dimmed, and he once again found himself in the body. Later on, he was able to verify everything he saw when he was allegedly unconscious. Mrs. Caroline Larson was a Vermont housewife who had never heard of out-of-body travel until one evening when she was laying in her bedroom being lulled to sleep by some chamber music performed by her husband and friends in another room. A feeling of deep depression and apprehension came over me, and soon a numbness crept over me until every muscle became paralyzed. The next thing I knew was that I was standing on the floor beside my bed, looking down attentively at my own physical body laying on it. Mrs. Larson walked downstairs in her new body, which she described as much more radiant than her physical body, and peeked in on the rehearsal. Later, where she eventually returned to her body, she was able to verify through her husband everything she had taken note of, things she could not have known normally. For years, experiences such as these have been reported, but there was no organized attempt to study these scattered reports until psychical researchers began to take an interest in them. Many merely dismissed them as dreams or hallucinations. Others, though, especially those whose minds had been kindled by the rapidly growing science of parapsychology, felt questions needed to be answered even if the out-of-body experience were merely imaginary. Why do these people seem to be able to describe things that occurred during their unconsciousness of which they could have had no knowledge? Mrs. Larson reported such a case. Also, if the experience were merely a hallucination, why do so many report seeing a silver cord connecting the physical body and the double? This cord is often mentioned by those undergoing the out-of-body experience. A.S. Wiltsey, a Kansas physician, reported after recovering from a grave illness how he had floated up and down until I broke free from the body and fell lightly on the floor. Moving toward the door of the room, he looked back and saw a small silver cord, like a spider's web, connecting his physical and superphysical bodies. Mrs. H.D. Williams, a British housewife, had a similar experience, which she sent to Dr. Robert Crookall, a British scientist who has spent several years studying the out-of-body experience. She wrote how she looked around during a spontaneous out-of-body experience and saw a shining white cord 2 or 3 inches wide, which was attached to the head of my physical body. Clearly, such bizarre reports as these prompt us to go further than merely brusquely labeling all such occurrences as imaginary. At the same time, it must be kept in mind that the OBE may represent an entire continuum of experiences. That is, what we label as the out-of-body experience may consist of several different phenomena which lead to the consciousness leaving the body, or there may be different types of OBEs. For example, in 1973, I went to Durham, North Carolina as a consultant at the Psychical Research Foundation, which was engaging in studying OBEs. The author was placed in charge of analyzing a collection of personal narratives being collected at PRF, and also cases collected by Dr. Louisa Rhine at the Foundation for Research on the Nature of Man. It appears from analyzing these reports that there are 3 different types of OBEs. In the first type, the experiencer feels that he is enveloped in an apparitional form. I was awakened by the sun shining through the door across my face and eyes. I got up to close the door, placed one hand on the knob, the other on the door itself in order to close it quietly, then changed my mind and walked across the room to the dresser. Up to this time, I didn't notice anything strange or different. I felt perfectly normal too, but when I looked in the mirror, I saw the strangest thing there. It looked like me, but it was just a white vapor image of myself. I wasn't frightened, just puzzled. I thought I must be ill and should go back to bed at once. A quick glance around the room showed both my sisters sleeping with their heads covered. Perhaps the light was bothering them also. When I reached my bed, there was I in bed and sound asleep. There were 2 of me. Yet on other occasions, the experiencer has no concept of form and experiences himself as merely consciousness floating in space. I was floating near the ceiling of the north window that opened on the rear garden. The colors of everything were vivid and glowing. I did not see myself as having any form. Time was suspended. Suddenly, I was in the bed again, feeling my body as heavy. Midway between these 2 forms of the experience are those in which the experiencer does not perceive himself as in a body, but in some other vehicle of separation. 25 years ago, I was seriously sick and was rushed to the hospital in a very serious condition from loss of blood caused by a hemorrhage. In this weak condition, the doctor decided on an exploratory operation, As he gave either and I drifted into a deep sleep, I felt as though I were going to die. The sensation was not painful, but as though I felt a tugging and pulling as in a game of tug-of-war. Finally, a little light hovered over my still form and all my senses were transferred into this small light. Or rather the little light flew around the operating room, watching everything that was taking place. What is even more bizarre is that a few, and this is rare, have had double releases. This is, they see both the physical and ultra-physical bodies independently from a third vantage point. Sometimes during the night, although I was unconscious, I saw the hospital room with doctors surrounding Dr. G, who was at my bedside. At the same time, I saw over my body, which was laying on the bed, another body of me suspended in midair in the exact position of hanging from the ceiling by what seemed to be a cord attached to my navel. I seemed to be an observer, but from where I cannot say. All I know is that I saw two bodies of myself. I watched this sight for some time. Analyzing out-of-body experience narratives presents certain problems. For one thing, those who have out-of-body experiences usually report them as a brief, once-in-a-lifetime occurrence. Are we getting an accurate picture of the phenomenon from these accounts? Is the OBE in fact more complex, sublime, and unworldly than the matter of fact I was floating above my body that one reads about? Luckily, we do not have to be kept in the dark about such matters or about the range of experiences one might undergo during the OBE, for there do exist a few books written by subjects who, for periods of up to several years, have undergone habitual out-of-body experiences and have kept somewhat detailed records of them. The first chronologue of out-of-body experiences comes to us from Oliver Fox, pseudonym for Hugh Calloway. Fox was a British occultist whose experiences began when he was a young man. Although he previously had bizarre experiences during his sleep and dream states, it was not until around 1902 that he had an inkling that he might be able to leave his body at will. Fox was asleep and dreaming that he was standing outside his home. Everything looked normal except that he was about to return to his house. He noticed that the stones on the pavement had changed position. In a flash, it dawned upon him that he was dreaming. Immediately, the dream took on a different characteristic. All colors became vivid and brilliant, and Fox himself underwent an almost mystical experience. Upon reflection, he began to doubt that he was actually dreaming. As he later wrote, "For although I did not realize at the time, I think this first experience was a true projection." Fox also made the significant remark that this was the first experience which revealed to him the world one sees during the OBE may not be exactly a copy of the real world. Fox soon learned that he could identify when he was dreaming by illogical occurrences in the dream, lucid dreaming. He also discovered that he could induce out-of-body experiences by manipulating these dreams of knowledge, as he called them, into the out-of-body experience state. Later, Fox learned other techniques for inducing the experience. These included identifying a false awakening, a state wherein the percipient wakes from sleep, usually cataleptic, and realizes that he is in astral consciousness and can leave the body at will. He ultimately developed a technique whereby he would concentrate on an imaginary trapdoor at the top of his head and hold this image until the door opened. He would then shoot out of his body through the open hatchway. Oddly, he eventually lost the ability to undergo out-of-body experiences by this method. The following is a rather typical OBE. As do many projectors, Fox would experience dual consciousness during the onset of the experience, during which he could feel himself both in the physical and non-physical bodies. I was lying in the bed in the afternoon when I experienced the false awakening. Imagining that my wife and two friends were sitting in the room and talking, I felt too tired to take a part in any of the conversation and went to sleep again. When I next became aware of my surroundings, I realized that I was in the trance condition, or catalepsy, and could leave my body. I therefore sat up, out of body as it were, and then leisurely got off the bed. Dual consciousness was very strong. I could feel myself lying in the bed and standing by it, my legs pressing against the coverlet. Simultaneously, though, I could see all the objects in the room quite clearly. I could not see my physical body when I looked for it upon the bed. Everything seemed just as real as in waking life, more so extra vivid, and I felt indescribably well and free, my brain seeming extraordinarily alert. I left the bed and walked slowly around the room to the door, the sense of dual consciousness diminishing as I moved farther away from the body. But just as I was going to leave the room, my body pulled me back instantaneously, and the trance was broken. Fox's experiences were riddled with enigmas. For example, he very rarely saw his own physical body, although he often looked for it. He rarely saw any connecting cord attaching his double to his physical body during the OBE. There is one notable exception to this, however, which many writers on the out-of-body experience overlook. Fox did describe seeing a silver thread during one experience he coerced while experimenting with ether. But Fox did feel characteristic tuggings at the back of his head before returning to his body. He often saw objects in his house which did not correspond to any physical object that graced his home, and on several occasions contacted many otherworld beings during his out-of-body adventures. One phenomenon that repeatedly crops up in Fox's accounts is his inability to control the experience or where it would take him. The following is typical. I proceeded to leave my body, dual consciousness being experienced until I had passed out of the house, but on reaching the street, I could not feel my physical body lying upon the bed. I had walked on for about 100 yards, apparently unobserved by the few people about. When I was caught up on some strong current and borne away with great velocity, I came to rest on a beautiful but unknown common. Fox recorded his experiences in 2 lengthy articles for the Occult Review and later expanded them into a book, Astral Projection. During the same time that Fox was recording his bizarre experiences and experiments in England, an American lad had been making similar discoveries. Sylvain Muldoon was a sickly youth whose perennial illness kept him bedridden for long periods. At the age of 12, while visiting a spiritualist camp in the Midwest, Muldoon awoke during the night to find himself paralyzed. The paralysis gave way to floating sensations, and the astonished boy found himself floating in the air. Upon standing erect, he turned to his bed and was greeted by a curious sight. He saw his body still in bed and found himself in an apparitional body connected to it by a shimmering silver cord. This was Muldoon's first experience. His illness, heart trouble it appears, seemed to prompt these experiences, and during the final years, he underwent hundreds of such experiences. Sometimes in the early 1920s, he read Hereward Carrington's book, Modern Psychical Phenomenon, which recapped French research into astral projection. His interest sparked, Muldoon wrote Carrington that he would be able to write a book on what the French authorities didn't know. The letter was prophetic. Carrington wrote back, a correspondence ensued, and in 1929 the two jointly produced Muldoon's autobiographical book, The Projection of the Astral Body. Muldoon's experiences were quite different from Fox's. His out-of-body experiences, for instance, were much more physical. He always found himself in an astral body, a term much popularized by Muldoon's writings, and usually found himself projected to earthly scenes. Unlike the bizarre adventures of his English contemporary, Muldoon did not appear to contact other dimensions, and only on rare occasions did he meet astral beings. Those he did encounter he felt to be discarnates. Muldoon's greatest contribution to the study of the out-of-body experience is probably his detailed remarks about the silver cord. As previously stated, he usually saw a silver thread connecting his astral and physical bodies via their heads. As he moved away from his physical body, the cord would become thinner and finally disappear. As the cord stretched, less and less consciousness with the physical body was felt. If he were ill, the hue of the cord would dull. Another intriguing factor of Muldoon's experiences is that, again, unlike Fox, he could even affect physical matter while out of the body. During one experience, he successfully set a metronome in motion. On another, he knocked his astral hand on wood, and those present heard raps. On a third occasion, Muldoon awoke while extremely ill and tried to reach his mother and sister in an adjoining room. Getting out of bed, he walked into his mother's room and tried to attract her attention. She could not see him, and he realized that he was actually in the out-of-body state. He persisted in trying to get his mother's attention, but his consciousness became blurred, and he awoke in his physical body. As he awoke, he could hear his relatives excitedly talking about how their mattress on the bed had suddenly turned itself. Like Fox, Muldoon also gave instructions on how to induce the out-of-body experience. His experiences usually occurred from the sleep state, and he felt that if one concentrated attention on producing an out-of-body experience before going to sleep, this would induce the experience. He also found that one could mentally construct a dream and induce the experience through it. For instance, Muldoon felt that flying dreams were especially good for this technique. Finally, he outlined relaxation techniques to induce the experience. As Muldoon grew older and his precarious health improved, his out-of-body experiences waned and finally practically ceased. But he kept an interest in the experience and authored a case collection, The Case for Astral Projection. In 1951, he wrote in conjunction with aging Hereward Carrington, The Phenomena of Astral Projection. Actually, though much of the work on this volume was completed by Muldoon's friend Vincent Gaddis, the well-known California writer on psychic phenomenon, magic, and related subjects. Muldoon spent the remainder of his life in the little town of Darlington, Wisconsin, and rarely would even discuss his experiences. However, in 1969, in reply to an inquiry, the author received a letter from which he revealed one bit of information which is important in assessing his experiences. The author had asked Muldoon if he had ever had a certain experience of an auditory nature during his out-of-body experiences, and he wrote back briefly and to the point, "I did not go into everything because I thought it would be asking them to swallow too big a pill. I have plenty I have not said." Unfortunately, this information died with him in 1971. Fox and Muldoon represent the two most detailed chroniclers of habitual out-of-body experiences which have come down to us. There have been others, though. Marcel Louis Foran, a French mystic who traveled extensively in China, wrote his experiences under the pen name of Yiram in a book translated as Practical Astral Projection. Cora Richmond, an American psychic, wrote her autobiography as My Experiment Out of the Body. Vincent Turvey, a British psychic and spiritualist, combined out-of-body experiences with clairvoyant and precognitive abilities as he recorded in his beginnings of seership. Others, such as William Dudley Pelley and Mrs. Shine Gifford, had complex single experiences which they wrote up in booklet form. One modern out-of-body voyager who has kept detailed records of his experiences is Professor J.H.M. Whiteman. Unlike Fox and Muldoon, who were products of naive occult and spiritualist backgrounds, Professor Whiteman is a professor of mathematics at Cape Town University, a scholar, philosopher, and student of mysticism. Whiteman has written up his myriad mystical, visionary, and out-of-body experiences in his book, The Mystical Life. It is hard to do justice to Whiteman's experiences since they are so complex. It is also difficult to summarize the interrelationships between mystical and out-of-body states, which are the core of his writings, or to condense his complex theories about the nature of the out-of-body experience, which he has outlined in the book The Philosophy of Space and Time. Basically, Whiteman feels that during the out-of-body experience, the percipient is cast into a non-physical replica of the physical world. This world mimics the appearance of the real world only because of the selective and conditioned perception of the subject. This is because the out-of-body percipient can only judge the realness of an experience by relating to it an experience of the real world. However, as time goes by, the subject may become used to the out-of-body state and this new world, and gradually comes to experience himself and his environment as very different from the physical world. During these transcendental experiences, the subject's level of consciousness may even partake of mystical awareness as his consciousness changes with the environment. Among Whiteman's concrete contributions to the autobiographical and experiential literature about the out-of-body experience are his detailed comments on the process of separation and return of the otherworld body. Like his predecessors, Whiteman usually perceives himself in some sort of form during the experience, and often feels dual consciousness when near the physical body and sensations of tugging at the back of his head when he is drawn back into the body. In these respects, his experiences are very conventional. Whiteman gives special consideration to what he calls visual and circular openings during the onset of the experience. Others, such as Fox and Erom, have written about holes in space through which they venture at the onset of the experience. Whiteman has given considerable space in his writings to these phenomena and how they might be key to initiating the out-of-body experience, as in the following report. The separation began with a special opening in which the surface of a whitewashed wall 2 feet away was studied with the full clarity of perception and the visual impressions of precise spatial position and of seeing through the eyelids of the physical eyes, which remained consciously shut. The opening then changed to one in which the heath-like country was seen in a wide panorama, with steep ground in front, and almost at once I was conscious for a few months of being catapulted and amidst that scene. As intimated, Whiteman himself is more occupied with the relationship of the OBE, not the physical world, but the mystical states of awareness. A natural mystic himself, Whiteman feels the out-of-body consciousness and mystic consciousness are intermingled, and the emphasis of his writings is on that relationship. Needless to say, Fox, Muldoon, and Whiteman all have had experiences which, while possessing similar characteristics, also reveal astounding differences. These differences seem to be inherently related to their personalities and predispositions. Muldoon was a product of the spiritualist movement, and his experiences conform to spiritualist beliefs. He found himself in an astral body, saw the dead on occasion, and visited earthly scenes in his astral body. Fox, an occultist and theosophist, found himself visiting higher realms, meeting otherworld beings, and trying to contact spiritual masters. Whiteman, a mathematician and mystic, undergoes mystical and abstract experiences. These autobiographical studies by gifted subjects do much to awaken us to the fact that the out-of-body experience is a very personal experience, and like the induced LSD experience, might be molded by the conditioning and expectancy of the subject. Nonetheless, the writings of gifted subjects do show certain similarities. They all report characteristic sensations of leaving and re-entering the body. They experience dual consciousness when in close proximity to the physical body. They perceive colors and objects more vividly than in the normal state. They might be projected to incredibly beautiful scenes which may or may not represent actual physical locations in the physical world. They have distinctive feelings of tuggings at the back of the head when they have been in the out-of-body state too long. They all find themselves in an other-world body of some sort, and they often see the physical world during the out-of-body experience as having slight inconsistencies from the real world. As with all reports by those who undergo the out-of-body experience, those by gifted subjects are a mixture of conformity and contradiction. One question that comes to mind is, are these voyagers really leaving the body physically? One incident from Fox's life sheds some light on this puzzle. Fox bragged about his experiences to his girlfriend, Elsie, who thereupon stated that she would project herself to his room that night to show that she too could prompt the experience. In bed that night, Fox became aware of Elsie's figure in the room. The next day, Elsie accurately described the layout of the room, a room she had never visited. Could it be, then, that even though many people have had the out-of-body experience and were invisible, that on occasion persons undergoing the experience might be seen by others? There's a rich collection of cases that would indicate that this is so. A group of such experiments were carried out by S.H. Beard, a friend of Edmund Gurney, who was one of the pioneers of the Society for Psychical Research. Gurney was so impressed by these experiments that he placed them in his co-authored 2-volume classic, Phantasms of the Living. The first experiment was in November of 1881. Beard wished to project himself to his fiancée, Miss L.S. Verity, and her young sister. The night of the experiment, Miss Verity woke up to see the apparition of her betrothed standing before her. She was so startled that she screamed. Her sister awoke and also saw the phantom. Beard afterwards would send Gurney postcards when he planned such impromptu experiments, and often Miss Verity would send Beard a dated letter, spontaneous, verifying that she had seen his apparition. On one occasion, the apparition even stroked her hair. Could it be that cases such as these are not really out-of-body experiences, but telepathically induced hallucinations caused by the intense thoughts of the experimenter? This theory has been highly favored by many parapsychologists, but can it explain all instances of this type? For instance, the following has become one of the most celebrated reports of an apparition of the living. One night, Mrs. Wilmot found herself in a restless sleep, worried about her husband, who was crossing the Atlantic on a steamer in stormy weather. Asleep in her secure home in Bridgeport, Connecticut, she found herself leaving her body and traveling across the sea and alighting on a ship. She found her way to a cabin and saw her husband and tried to approach him. She saw another man in a berth set back above his. She hesitated but continued in, kissed her husband, and departed. The next day, Wilmot told witnesses that he had a vision in which his wife came to him and kissed him. What is novel in this case is that his cabin mate, William Tate, had also seen the phantom, whom he had taken to be a living woman, and joked to Wilmot about having a woman visit him at night. Mrs. Wilmot made note of her experience, and especially the odd setback berth. When all the notes were compared, everything was mutually corroborative. The cross-evidence of all the testimony was so strong that Mrs. Eleanor Sidgwick, another pioneer of psychical research, included it in her paper on the evidence for clairvoyance published in the Proceedings for the Society for Psychical Research. Many psychics have also claimed to have had out-of-body experiences, to have traveled over wide distances and accurately report what they have witnessed. A fascinating experiment along these lines was undertaken by the late Eileen Garrett, famous medium and founder of the Parapsychology Foundation. Mrs. Garrett attempted to project to Reykjavik, Iceland, Dr. D. Svensson, a physician. Mrs. Garrett attempted to experiment in conjunction with Dr. Anita Moole. After a period of concentration, Mrs. Garrett found herself in a strange country and in an unknown room. She noted the position of various objects and saw Svensson with a bandage around his head. The doctor was then engaged in a reading of physics text. Mrs. Garrett reported all this during a semi-trance to Dr. Moole. After the experiments, they received a letter from Svensson verifying independently what Mrs. Garrett had accurately reported. Mrs. Garrett's experiment is a little different from most out-of-body experiences and is properly termed traveling clairvoyance, that is, seeing at a distance. This phenomenon overlaps with the out-of-body experience and is almost impossible to make a clear division between the two. A more conventional, though much more informal experiment was carried out by Mrs. Gladys Leonard, another famous medium. One afternoon while she was resting, she unexpectedly had an out-of-body experience. She heard her husband go to the door and thought it might be a novel experiment to see who was there via an out-of-body experience. Instantly, she found herself at her husband's side. She saw him give this visitor a coin from his pocket. After a few more astral adventures, Mrs. Leonard returned to her body. Upon waking, she gave her husband details about the incident, which the startled man verified. Until recently, most of our data on the out-of-body experience has been merely collections of personal experiences, with little scientific analysis. It was not until the 60s that the OBE began to be studied by two scientists with drastically different approaches, though both made important advances in our understanding of the phenomenon. The first of these was Dr. Robert Crookall, who has had an eminent career as a scientist. A holder of 2 doctorates, he was formerly on the faculty of the University of Aberdeen and later principal geologist of the HM Geological Survey. He retired from his position in order to devote full time to studying reports and analyzing cases of out-of-body experiences. Crookall was struck by the relationship between the many independent reports of the OBE. Like Carrington and Muldoon, he began to collect as many reports as possible. However, unlike his predecessors, he was interested in a critical analysis of his data in the hopes that in investigation a large number of cases, the data itself would reveal a little about the experience. To date, Dr. Crookall has collected close to 1,000 reports drawn from the literature of psychical research and from first-hand accounts sent to him. These cases have appeared in 3 of his 12 books on the out-of-body experience: The Study and Practice of Astral Projection, More Astral Projections, and Casebook of Astral Projection. Thus far, Crookall has offered 4 different types of analysis of his data. All of these have revealed hitherto unknown characteristics about the experience. The first analysis was based on what is known as Whately's Law of Evidence. This principle is that if enough independent witnesses agree upon the characteristics of an observation when it is obvious, then they could not have consorted together. Then the observation has a high likelihood of being genuine and not falsified. In analyzing over 300 cases, Krukal did find overall unity among the reports. These characteristics were scattered among hundreds of cases, yet 6 primary traits were revealed. 1. The percipient feels that he is leaving the physical body through the head. 2. A blackout occurs at the moment of separation of consciousness from the body. 3. The apparitional body hovers above the physical body. 4. The apparitional body resumes this position before the termination of the experience. And 5. A blackout occurs at the moment of reintegration. 6. Rapid re-entry causes shock to the physical body. Krukal's case studies also revealed that many times persons undergoing the OBE see other apparitions, exhibit ESP, could find themselves in a dim, misty environment or a paradise-like world, and finally that a silver cord was very often seen during the experience. Professor Hornell Hart, formerly of Duke University, was also fascinated by the OBE and Dr. Krukal's work. He noted, his colleagues' case studies also showed that the experience was cross-cultural and that even very young children reported the experience. Krukal's second analysis is even more interesting. Even though all out-of-body experiences fit into the general patterns, there seem to be qualitative differences between accounts. In order to better evaluate this, Dr. Krukal broke down his case into large groupings. One group was of projections which occur naturally near sleep, or caused by illness or exhaustion. The other consisted of those experiences that were forced by the use of anesthetics, shock, suffocation, hypnosis, or willful projection. By comparing these two sets of data, he found that natural out-of-body experiences were much more vivid and had different overall characteristics than those which had been forced. For example, over 10% of those reporting out-of-body experiences described leaving through the head, yet not even half that amount reported this as occurring in enforced projection. Hornell Hart did a statistical assessment of these differences between the two sets of material and found that chances of this occurring by chance alone would be millions to 1. Krukal's third analysis was to compare reports by psychics to those of ordinary people who had reported the experience. It was discovered that by and large, psychics report experiences very much like enforced projections, while the non-psychic individuals have experiences similar to natural projections. Krukal recently published fourth analysis reveals that many out-of-body experiences occur in 2 stages. By analyzing first-hand reports, he has shown that a large proportion of accounts report an initial state of confusion during the onset of the experience, a clearing of consciousness, and a return vagueness at the end of the experience. Another large group of cases seems to represent a one-stage release. Krukal's painstaking research has probably done more than anything else to help parapsychology understand the out-of-body experience. He has built elaborate and carefully constructed theories about the out-of-body experience on the basis of his research, and his basic view is that the OBE does demonstrate that man possesses an ultra-physical body which has the ability to survive death. Krukal's work also shows that all the scattered reports of the OBE can be assessed scientifically. The other pioneer in the study of the OBE is Dr. Charles Tart, an experimental psychologist. It was Tart's intention to discover if certain persons claiming to have the experience repeatedly could produce an OBE in a laboratory where it could be monitored in the same way as dreams, by following brainwave patterns, rapid eye movements indicative of dreaming, etc. Tart's work can be considered the first important experimental work with the out-of-body experience. Dr. Tart's first subject was Mr. X, now known to be Robert Monroe, who has now authored his autobiography, Journeys Out of Body. The first experiments were carried out at the University of Virginia in 1965 and 1966. After a week of experimenting, Monroe finally achieved an out-of-body experience. It was hoped that Monroe could leave the experimental room in the out-of-body state and move to an adjoining room and report what he saw. During the whole time, he was monitored by an electroencephalograph and other devices. It was also hoped that Monroe could read a 6-digit number placed 6 feet above the floor on the shelf. The experiment was partially successful. Monroe reported that the technician was in the corridor with a man. This was correct. The monitoring apparatus revealed that Monroe was in some sort of dream state during the out-of-body experience. When the experiments were repeated at Davis, California, a similar reading was recorded along with a drop in blood pressure. Tart's second gifted subject was called Mrs. Z. In the report on the second night of experiments with her, also carried out at Davis, Miss Z reported an out-of-body experience. Her EEG readings recorded at the time could not be classified as either sleeping or waking. Tart had hoped that she would be able to read a random number placed on a shelf above her to which she had no normal access. This was successfully read by Miss Z on the fourth night. The number could only be read if one floated up above the shelf. Unfortunately, Dr. Tart discovered that the number could be reflected on a clock located in the room if a bright light were shown on the number. However, it is doubtful whether the subject read it in this manner. Odd EEG patterns were once again recorded. Currently, similar experiments are being carried out by Dr. Carlos Osis, Director of Research for the American Society for Psychical Research. His subject, Ingo Swann, has so far shown very promising results. In these tests, Swann reclines in a chair and, while retaining consciousness, describes target objects on a ledge above him or in another room. Since ESP is a rather vague ability, if Swann were using only this faculty, he would not be likely to be able to describe the target objects in their correct proportion or perspective. However, if he really was projecting himself to the target area and was actually seeing the targets, he should report them in detail, in correct perspective, etc., just as we do with normal vision. Swann has on several occasions succeeded remarkably well in these tasks. During an ASPR test, the target was a bullseye target with a wedge-shaped piece removed. Swann reported the target perfectly but mixed the colors of the concentric circles. Another target for this test was red heart, over which was laid a black leather letter opener holder. Swann, after his OBE, diagrammed an oval which he indicated was red with a black wrench-shaped object over it. It was nearly perfect. Swann's OOB vision is certainly more than what ESP could account for, but it is still not up to par with normal vision. On one occasion, he had to project himself to a sealed room. He reported during his OOBE that he could not see because there was no light in the room. The ASPR research assistant, Janet Mitchell, told me that when she went into the room, she found the bulb had been burned out. A different line of OOB experimentation has been carried out at the Psychical Research Foundation in Durham with a Duke University student, Stuart Blue Hooray. At first, Hooray attempted to leave the PRF building in the out-of-body state and see what letter had been placed on a poster in another building. Blue was successful, but his ability to see soon trailed off. The next procedure was for him to OOB into another room and report on what target people were there, and they in turn would try to guess when they thought Blue was there. Again, at first Blue and the human detectors were accurate, but the ability of both eventually sagged. Ultimately, the use of animal detectors was used. During rigorous controlled tests, Blue would project to the experimental area where a kitten was playing on a shuffleboard-like apparatus, marked off into segments, from which the experimenter can judge the animal's normal activity by counting how many sections of the board it transversed in a given period and how many times it vocalized. Each time Blue projected to the kitten, it ceased its activity and stopped meowing. During my own stay at PRF, we used a snake which reacted vigilantly by appearing to attack the side of the cage when Blue was reporting to be with it. With the work of parapsychologists such as Charles Tart, Carlos Osis, and Robert Morris heading the team at PRF, the study of the OBE has emerged from the realm of anecdote into the domain of experimentation. However, it cannot be said that the work with Harari, Swann, and others is the first experimental work on the out-of-body experience, for systematic experimentation with the out-of-body experience was also a mainstay of early French psychical research years ago, which offered much fascinating work which has been mostly forgotten by modern parapsychology. The early French psychical researchers were produced by a rich heritage of French and German occultism, influenced by the writings of Reichenbach, Justinius Kerner, the mesmerist, young Stilling, and others, they accepted the occult belief the human body contained a fluidic force or psychic fluid. This mysterious substance was supposed to be manipulated during magnetism or hypnosis, and could even produce psi phenomena. This fluid could be projected to move an object, ostensibly psychokinesis, and was called exteriorization of motivity, or it could pervade a building, thus making it haunted. The early French researchers were also fascinated by a phenomenon they called traveling clairvoyance, wherein a mesmerized subject could be directed to project his or her consciousness to a distant place and report on what it saw. The outgrowth of these concepts was that the human body itself consisted not only of a physical organism but a fluidic double as well, which would be exteriorized by proper mesmeric methods. Soon, experiments were designed to prove the existence of this double. While these experiments might seem naive to us today, they are highly interesting and can be considered the first attempts at scientific investigation of the out-of-body experience. The first researchers to systematically experiment with the fluidic double were Albert de Rochas and H. Duville. De Rochas would magnetize his subjects and then try to detach only part of the double, such as an arm. De Rochas would prick the astral limb, allegedly lying slightly above the physical one, and see if the subject would respond at the corresponding time. They usually did. Similar experiments were carried out by such scientists as Paul Joie and Émile Bourac, rector of the Dijon Academy, but it was a moot point if such experiments really indicated the presence of a fluidic double. It was D'Urville, though, whose experiments are more interesting and suggestive of the fluidic double. He hoped to see if he could completely exteriorize the double, as de Rochas had claimed to have done, and then prove its independent existence by clairvoyant and instrumental detection. His first experiments were to exteriorize the double and collect the testimony of clairvoyant observers. These observers did seem to give uniform descriptions of the double. They described it as luminescent and connected to the physical body by a double cord-like link from the head or spleen of the subject's physical body. The cord was also seen as a glowing or pulsating. The observations matched the testimony of many individuals who, during their spontaneous out-of-body experiences, have also seen a cord, even two cord connections between the physical and astral bodies. D'Urville also gave directions to the double to walk in certain directions and carry out certain acts, and the observers would often report seeing the double actually doing these very procedures. However, D'Urville's experiments report some results which are more interesting and evidential than the reports of clairvoyant observers. He instructed the double to move physical objects which could be perceptible to the experimenters as ostensible telekinesis. Sure enough, D'Urville reported that the double was able to shuffle a chair, rattle a table, and depress a delicate weight. Another curious experiment by D'Urville carried out was with specially prepared luminescent screens coated with calcium sulfate. He exposed two luminous screens to light and then kept them in the dark for several days. These screens remained dark when placed on the knees of a control subject, but immediately glowed when the double was instructed to approach them. During these experiments, D'Urville was able to photograph the glowing scenes. An attempt was made to photograph the double itself, and perhaps these experiments are the most amazing. The subject for these tests was May Lebert, a gifted mesmeric subject with whom de Rochas had carried out many of his experiments and whose double has been exteriorized with reported success by de Rochas and D'Urville. 60 trials were carried out trying to photograph the double, 2 of which seemed to have been successful. In the first photograph, a human-like misty form was caught swaying to the side. This in itself is interesting, as many persons report spontaneous out-of-body experiences, report how they swayed to and fro when trying to move in their new body. In the second photograph, the figure had become erect and had formed into a recognizable female figure, although still opaque. D'Urville wrote up his experiments in a lengthy volume, Les Fantômes des Vivants. Charles Lancelin carried out similar experiments and also reported that he had completely exteriorized the double and had carried out similar instrumental detections of it. He reported that during one experiment he was able to get the double of his subject to impress its fingers onto a sensitive photographic plate. Upon the conclusion of the experiment, odd fingerprint forms were found impressed on the photograph. However, Lancelin was more eager to learn how to experimentally project the double without the use of hypnosis and tried to develop techniques to consciously and willfully project it. In his elaborate volume Méthode de doublement personnel, he reported on his findings. Lancelin gave detailed instructions on how the subject must sit in a chair under just the right atmospheric conditions and concentrate on dynamizing the will. And finally, to slowly detach the double and project it to a target percipient. The percipient must at the same time concentrate on bringing the agent's double. It is curious that these techniques are in keeping with some theories of apparitions, which argue that an apparition is built up by the joint union of the minds of the agent and the percipient. Lancelin also gave detailed description of the double, which again seemed to confirm D'Urville's observations, of which Lancelin was of course fully aware. However, they also matched the reports we have today of many who have had out-of-body experiences. Lancelin reported that during the projection, the double is connected to the physical body by a cord linking the head of the double to the solar plexus of the body. Again, many persons report spontaneous out-of-body experiences state the same thing. This work is historically significant since many cases recording such a cord were collected before Lancelin's work first became known to English readers, where Hereward Carrington summarized it in the book Modern Psychical Phenomena in 1919. This argues against the theory that all these allusions to a cord were cribbed from previous accounts. No matter what one thinks of these early experiments, they do represent a formidable array of experimental techniques and designs which should be of interest to researchers today. Like any experiments in parapsychology, the very least they do is serve as an argument for further exploration. Yet where do all these studies, anecdotal and experimental alike, lead us? These are the areas of psychical research that are drastically affected by research on the out-of-body experience. The first is the study of apparitions. Hornell Hart believed that the out-of-body experience could be key to understanding apparitions, since many apparitions of the living have been recorded as well as apparitions of the dead. In a masterly study, Hart analyzed the characteristics of these two bodies of apparitional cases and found that they shared the same characteristics. Thus, he felt that the two types of apparitions were of the same nature and most likely represent a mechanism similar to the out-of-body experience. The second area affected by our study of the OBE is that of survival of death. Both Hart and Robert Crookall have stated that they feel the OBE demonstrates that conscious life is possible, spatially distant and separated from the physical body. Consciousness is not dependent on the body and could therefore survive death. Third, the out-of-body experience drastically alters our concept of what consciousness is. During the out-of-body experience, the percipient is often catapulted into new sensory experiences and levels of consciousness. For example, some of Dr. Tart's EEG readings of OBEs are similar to readings obtained by practitioners of Zen in meditation. Like the mystical experiences which bring with it an expanding of consciousness, the out-of-body experience may well be an avenue to a new world of the mind. As one percipient wrote from Raynard Johnson's Watcher on the Hills, "It was a night in October, about 11 p.m. I suddenly found myself out of the body, floating over a highland moor, in a body as light or lighter than air. There was a wood at the side of the moor, and a cool, fresh wind was flowing. I found that I didn't mind the wind as I should have done had I been in my physical body, because I was at one with it. The life in the wind and the clouds and the trees was within me also, flowing into me and through me, and I offered no resistance to it. I was filled with glorious life. All the time in the margin of my consciousness, I knew where my earthly body was, and that I could return to it instantly if danger threatened. The experience may have lasted a few minutes or a few seconds, I cannot tell, for I was outside of time." So I felt like this was a really good summary of the research on out-of-body experiences. I've had people that have told me they don't believe that it's possible to leave your body. And if you're coming from that scientific perspective that it's just not possible, that it's not realistic research. Simply not true. The research has indicated that we do travel outside of the body. There's still a lot that we don't know. And I personally believe the research that I see from here is not as extensive as it was in the past. Who's doing this research now? I really want to know who is doing this research. One common thing I get a lot of questions about on the Facebook group and in messages is when people suffer some sort of cataleptic effect where they wake up and they're frozen. They can't move. They're stuck and frozen. And a lot of times I believe what's happening is that you're having an out-of-body experience, but you're simply not aware, or your consciousness is not in the other body. That is one thing that they talk about, is this experience where you're seemingly paralyzed temporarily. And oftentimes that may be that your body is somewhere else. The other part of you is somewhere else. Check out my meditation on astral projection if you want to try to astrally project. I use some techniques in that video. Also, check out my meditation on remote viewing. We may not actually be traveling outside the body. We may be using some sort of thought projection to allow us to travel and see what's going on outside of the body, but it is just part of our mind, as one of those researchers indicated. And you can do that through remote viewing. All things are available to you. I've had several experiences like this, but it's hard for me to remember. I've tried my best to program my subconscious mind so that I could remember the experience after it happened. I've tried to journal with it, and one common thing I've noticed is if you hear a high-pitched noise, it's sort of the sound of the astral. There's a high-pitched noise that you hear right before you go in. There's a pop. So sometimes I find myself listening for that high-pitched noise. There are a variety of ways to leave the body. You can use the pulling rope technique. You can leave outside of your head. You can try to move your legs and body outside of your body. What I have found is everybody responds a little bit differently. And for some people, they simply can't do it. And it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't matter if you can't do it. But if you're interested in it, then this gives you some background research on its validity. I would love for you to share your stories with me. Please, I'll be checking out the comments. I would love to know if you've traveled outside of your body, how you do it, what you think is actually happening. Let's treat the comments like a laboratory, and let's use that laboratory to learn even more. Please put a like on this video. It's one of the only ways it's recognized by the algorithm. And you can find all episodes of The Reality Revolution at therealityrevolution.com. Check out the links in the description for our New Earth trainings and the Aura program, or a link if you want to purchase my book, The Reality Revolution. Sending all the love and light to everyone listening. And welcome to The Reality Revolution.